It's 9 o'clock Central African Time. Welcome to Media Monitor on SABC News Channel 404. And thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Sakina Kamwendo, and I'll be with you for the next hour unpacking the biggest stories of the past week. And here's what we have in store for you this morning. We'll take a look at the hotly contested Metsimaholo by-elections. And then, with less than 2 weeks to go before the much-anticipated elective conference, we will delve deeper into the ANC's challenges, the split in leadership, and also court battles in the various provinces, as well as the factional battles. And lastly, we'll take a look at the slave trade and ask, is enough being done to protect migrants seeking a better life overseas? And we'll also touch on Zimbabwe's new president, Emmerson Mnangagwa's new cabinet. But before we unpack all of these stories, let's first take a look at the headlines with Simpiwe Ngongwana.
Very good morning to you, Sakina.
And to you, Simpiwe.
And morning to all our viewers out there. Now, let's take a look at the top stories making news headlines, and I'll have all the headlines at 10 o'clock. Now, the ANC's National Election Commission says the power to nominate the party's national leader will always rest with the branches. Now, the commission statement comes after Gauteng's nomination of Cyril Ramaphosa as its preferred candidate for party president. Now, Ramaphosa received nominations from 374 Gauteng branches, easily outstripping his main rival, the Member of Parliament, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who garnered nominations from 64 branches. Now, this nomination follows a 3-day ANC Gauteng Provincial General Council currently underway in Pretoria. DA leader Mmusi Maimane has called on the police to go to the ANC conference to protect its members because, listen to this, they are going to kill each other. He says, judging from the fact that the ANC has been taken to court by its own members questioning the outcomes of provincial and regional conferences, there still is a possibility that its elective conference due to take place at Nazareth in Johannesburg will be characterized by lawlessness. The ANC has rubbished speculation that the National Elective Conference may be under threat because of disagreements between members. Meanwhile, Joe McClover, the re-elected chairperson of the DA in the Northwest, says the party is closing the gap as the official opposition and is doing much better than the ANC. Coming up in sport at 10 o'clock, Bidvest are the 2017 Telkom Knockout champions. They beat Bloemfontein Celtic by a solitary goal at the Princess Magogo Stadium in KwaMashu. Vincent Pule scored the winner to hand Gavin Hunt the only trophy that has been eluding him. Wits have won the Telkom Knockout competition for the first time in the PSL era. More on this and other stories coming to you live at 10 o'clock right here on SABC News. For now, it's back to Media Monitor with Sakina.
The Law Society has slammed notices sent to 4 universities to jack up standards or risk losing their LLB courses. The Council on Higher Education issued a stern warning to the universities to conform within 6 months.
I think it will affect the university. I think outside the law faculty, there's a funding issue.
It's been 112 years since Enoch Sontonga died as a relatively unknown composer, choir master and teacher. But today his legacy lives on through his greatest composition, Nkosi Sikeleli Afrika.
For all your news updates, stay tuned to Your World from Monday to Sunday.
And welcome back to Media Monitor. Our guest this morning, we're pleased to be joined by former editor and political analyst Mpumelelo Mkabela, and we also have with us media analyst Melo Magolejo, and as usual, someone from our digital news production team. Tepito Moshe is with us this morning, and later on we'll be joined by IEC Deputy Chairperson Terry Tselane. But first of all, good morning, gentlemen, and thank you so much for coming on to the show. Well, let's take a look at what the Sunday papers are leading with this morning. And starting with the Sunday Times, this morning they are running with the headline about former SAA chairwoman Dudu Myeni, her new top job in government. Now, the article reveals that Myeni, who's a close friend of President Jacob Zuma, has been given a position this week as special advisor to Transport Minister Joe Maswanganyi. The city press is leading with Mpumalanga Premier David Mabuza issuing an ultimatum to the two presidential frontrunners, Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa and former AU Commission Chairperson Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, to abide by the demands or to face losing the bulk of the province's 736 delegates to the opposite side. The Sunday Independent today running with ANC presidential hopeful Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma and her support for the establishment of a commission of inquiry to investigate state capture so the country can move on to focus on other issues. In the Sunday Tribune this morning, they leading with a story about a residential estate nightmare. Now, Ravindra Bikramchand is suing his neighbor and the estate management of Kindlewood Estate after a wall collapsed onto his home, causing estimated damage of more than 5 million rand. And the Weekend Argus, they leading with the story about the unfair allocation of police resources, citing that allocation is racially based and favors affluent communities at the expense of predominantly black areas that are ravaged by violent crime. So that's what you can look forward to in the papers this morning. But let's shift focus and look at what stories were trending on social media this week. So please take us through that.
Morning, Sakina, and morning to the viewers at home. Sakina, our first hashtag for this week is Metsimaholo. Now, this comes after by-elections were held this week in Metsimaholo. And Sakina, many people took to Twitter to congratulate the SACP and lambast the ANC for their performance. As you can see here on your screen, that are saying, if only IEC was not ANC, then Metsimaholo will be free from freaks. Hashtag Metsimaholo. The second one is from Temba, saying what happened at Metsimaholo is a wake-up call for opposition parties to be very much careful on IEC in 2019. Rather, these guys working with ANC, don't trust them. Hashtag Metsimaholo.
And Jabu Joseph Sordo saying the ANC lost its relevance a long time ago, and Metsimaholo there. And it's going to be interesting because we do have Mr. Terry Tselane from the IEC with us later on. But I'd love to hear from Melo and also from Mpumelelo what your take was on Metsimaholo. What was the big standout for you, Mpumelelo?
Well, the big thing for me was the fact that the SACP, which is an alliance partner of the ANC, for the first time since 1994, decided to contest elections, decided to go face-to-face with the ANC in that area, which in a way was the beginning of what one might call the unraveling of the alliance, because the SACP and COSATU have been calling for the restructuring of the alliance because they think the two of them, it doesn't work for them the way it's structured at the moment. And they have not been, seemingly they have not been getting any positive response from the ANC. Then they've decided, well, let's test whether people would vote for us. And Metsimaholo became the first testing ground. And the fact that they got few seats there means that there is a bit of support from the SACP on the ground.
Well, we'll look at those results later on and unpack it further.
Okay, Sakina, our next hashtag is Selborne College. Now, Sakina, yesterday afternoon, a picture, an iconic picture of Hector Peterson surfaced on social media, being edited with his face replaced with a dog face, and that generated a lot of criticism towards the college. As you can see, some of the tweets on your screen here from Zoo saying, "I'm interested as to what action Selborne College will do about this." Hashtag Selborne College. The second one is from Broken Glass saying, racist people are sick. At some point, we've got to stop paying attention to patients who's resisting treatment. Hashtag Selborne College. And this is the picture, Sakina. Some are making comparison to a picture which surfaced earlier this year around the 16th of June. And this is yesterday's picture. That also generated a lot of commentary.
And interesting there, the question by Shaka Kilimu, who asked which one is worse. The one that we saw earlier on, it's been doing the rounds, I think, for a couple of years now at June 16 celebration time, and now Selborne College. Miller, what's your take?
I mean, obviously, as a country, we're still struggling with the legacy of racism, and racism, I think, still lives within us, especially given the inequality and the socio-economic structure that we have in the country. But I think one thing also that we're noticing on social media is that what tends to get surfaced is a lot of the concerns of people that do have access to social media. I mean, racism is widespread across the country, so in that sense, it tends to make it sort of like an elitist project every time we call out racism. There's people on the ground that do experience day-to-day racism that never get this type of airtime. So I think in that sense also, it's something that we must obviously also watch out for.
Fair point.
Sakina, our last hashtag is fill up FNB Stadium. Now, we know that yesterday, was trying to fill up the dome. I mean, FNB Stadium. And earlier last year, he filled the dome. And that, Sakina, generated a lot of commentary on social media with all of the tweets that we've seen congratulating him on a job well done. As you can see, although the stadium was not packed, but 68,000 people filling that stadium is an achievement. And here our first tweet is from Kay saying, hashtag fill up FNB Stadium. Congratulations to Casper Nyovest for filling up FNB Stadium. 66,000 people is a great attendance anywhere in the world.
Ian Phoenix says, congratulations. What is that?
Tibib.
What's Tibib?
I don't know. That's what they call him on
Congratulations, Tibib. You did it. Hashtag fill up FNB Stadium.
And our final one is from Samkelo saying, legit proud of Ed Casper Nyovest. He did the impossible. I'm so inspired right now. Hashtag fill up the dome. And as you can see below that, some of the pictures that came from the FNB Stadium concert.
Yeah, I think after the Abdul Bamji days, the PSL definitely need to have a chat with Casper Nyovest there about filling up the stadiums when there are matches. But Tsipiso, thanks for that. So we're going to leave the social media interaction there for now. After the break, we'll take a look at the Metsimaholo by-election, so do stay tuned.
Violence against women, it also talks to such behavior where teachers, instead of educating kids and give them dignity, they strip them of their dignity.
The First Lady.
The First Lady, her action, it's just unacceptable. I must say that it cannot be condoned. If I had it my way, I would say we had to act and make sure that he goes to jail.
This scourge is not ceasing.
The angry people, the intolerant, it's so huge. So then the scourge finds itself within that particular environment. You cannot say that it's a standalone. It's influenced by social ills, economic challenges.
Join me in Port Sedu live every Monday to Thursday at 17:30.
You're watching Media Monitor, and of course, one of the big stories this week was taking place in Metsimaholo. Now, the much-anticipated Metsimaholo by-election, it's come and gone, basically, with the ANC retaining all 16 wards that it had controlled initially, while the DA held on to the 5 that it controlled, while the EFF saw an increase from the votes it won last year. Interestingly, though, the SACP contested the election separate from its alliance partner, the ANC, this for the first time since the dawn of democracy. Now, the SACP's Free State Secretary, Begistofile, claimed that the votes were rigged, and he also accused the IEC of allowing the manipulation of the voting process. The ANC was accused of bussing people in from outside the Metsimaholo area to vote in a desperate scramble to secure victory, which the governing party has, of course, denied. Well, gentlemen, very interesting one. And of course, it wasn't the only by-election, but for obvious reasons, Metsimaholo needed, some attention on it. Firstly, it was the entire municipality. So you had 21 wards up for contest, as well as the 21 PR seats that were also up for grabs, 42 all in all. And that is the first thing that sets it apart from the other by-elections taking place. But of course, you also had the SACP for the first time going it alone without the ANC. And much speculation around that particular process. But of course, what do you think they would have learned from what happened in Metsimaholo, Mpumelelo?
Well, I think for me, it appears that the SACP was really doing a test case, given the broader problems they're having with the ANC at the broader alliance level. So they were doing a test case in Metsimaholo whether they can actually, whether there's appetite for voters, to vote for them. And in that process, they brought a very interesting dimension in a sense that they also assisted opposition parties to monitor the elections and to pick up what they call, wrong practices and the rigging. And they actually lodged an objection, which the IEC, by the way, took into account. In one of the wards, they had to rerun the election. So the SSCP didn't just, break away from the ANC to contest on its own. It brought a new dimension into the election. And I think from that process, I think they will be spurred on to actually contest many more elections. But what they couldn't do, and this is where we are back to square one, what they couldn't do is to basically shift, reconfigure power in the area. So we're back into square one. There's still a stalemate in Metsimaholo. You still need a coalition a government to be formed. So there's still a risk that the government can collapse. People forget that the reason why we are here is simply because the government of Metsimaholo collapsed because it couldn't pass budget, it couldn't do proper running of the municipality because of factionalism, because there's no dominant party.
Yeah.
So although the SSCP injected some kind of dynamism in the election, make it more interesting and colorful, it still couldn't help in terms of tilting the power scales.
And I think it remains to be seen whether this is going to be basically the feature of South African politics going forward. Many anticipating that this is what it will look like, more broadly speaking, after 2019. But Mr. Terry Tselane from the IEC, in years gone by, the IEC was always seen as one of the best institutions in this country, beyond reproach. But sadly, that reputation, has now been sullied in several ways over a period of time. But just looking at what happened in Metsimaholo, irregularities, were there any, and what exactly were they?
Of course, there were minor challenges in Metsimaholo, and as soon as those came to attention, we deal with them. But I need to emphasize one element here. Is that the issues that you are seeing now, it's as a result of the intense contestation between the political parties. It is not that the organization has changed in terms of its ethics, in terms of its culture, and in terms of its commitment to ensure that it runs the elections with integrity. So, but because now you have a situation where the contest between the political parties is intense, each and every vote does count, and therefore the political party's scrutiny over the elections has increased, and therefore they are able to identify in areas where there are difficulties and challenges to say, here are the problems. Now, in Metsimaholo, the first problem that we had in one of the stations, I think, Mpumlele unfortunately said that we had a rerun. We didn't have a rerun in Metsimaholo.
Yeah, there were reports that there would be a rerun.
Yeah, there was a possibility of a rerun in a particular station, but after we looked at that station, we felt that there was no need for us to have a rerun because the problem was that a political party or a candidate that was contesting in that election was not in the ballot when they started voting. So it is only after about 80 people had voted that they realized that there was a problem because the ballot paper that was actually brought in there belonged to a different ward. And as you know, you've got different candidates contesting different wards from time to time. So immediately when that happened, we quarantined that ballot box and we said we are not going to be opening that ballot box until such time that we have dealt with a voting in that voting. So you don't stop voting.
Was this an SACP candidate?
No, it was not.
It wasn't.
Yeah.
And because there were also allegations that ballot papers, some of them didn't have the SACP. So it begs the question, how far in advance were those ballot papers actually printed?
No. All the ballot papers had the political parties there. The only thing that I've indicated here was a mix-up in terms of two books in a particular voting station. In Kopanelung Primary School, that's where we identified the problem. And immediately after identifying the problem, we quarantined the ballot box and we said we are going to start with a new ballot box, and then voting continued. We never stopped voting in that particular station. And it is only after we were done with voting that we went back to that ballot box. And as a commission, we took a determination we made a determination that those ballot boxes for the PR should actually be counted, but for the ward, we decided that those should actually be quarantined.
So essentially, you've denied 80 voters, by your account, their opportunity to express their choice in terms of candidate.
That's exactly what happened in that particular station. But remember also what we have done as a commission. Immediately after you've looked at all the votes in that particular station, you do what we call the materiality test. Materiality test, in other words, we are going to take those votes and give them to each political party and then see as to whether it was going to make any difference in terms of the overall results, whether it was going to be making changes in terms of the ward representation, or it was going to make a difference in terms of the proportionality or seat allocation. So we do that in order to make sure that we don't end up really making a mistake and disfavoring a particular political party.
So just coming back to that question of how far in advance are ballot papers printed, what is the normal practice there?
Well, normally by 2 weeks before the elections, the ballot papers are done.
And the same happened here in Metsimaholo?
Yeah.
And then, Melo, just listening to what happened here, there were also allegations of people being bussed in. And of course, the Concord had to essentially step in and make sure that the IEC gets its house in order as far as the integrity of the voters' roll is concerned. You have until June 2018 to do that. But how do you think, these continued allegations of vote rigging and people being bussed in and people who are deceased still having their names appear on the voters' roll, how are these sort of incidents impacting on the integrity and the validity of elections?
Yeah, so it's a very important question. So for me, my entry point into this thing would be to look at the current world that we're in terms of the 21st century, in terms of social media and the dissemination of news, right? I think that fundamentally changes the landscape to what we used to previously. Because what happens now is that previously you could have news organizations that you could control and say, no, Sunday Times, City Press, don't print this, we're still looking at it. But now what happens is that people share things on social media and it spreads very quickly, and that I think in itself tends to undermine the integrity of an institution, whether or not there is actually a valid concern, right? So I think that's one of the things that the IEC needs to look at in terms of like managing that process. And I think for me, one of the things that they need to do in this new type of environment is to move more towards a more transparent type of environment where people can actually see the process as it's going along and not just have something happening in the background. So for me, one thing that I think is very important, for example, is if we were to move perhaps to a system where each ballot box, each ballot paper had maybe some sort of identifier, and then there was a database that people could access, they could see exactly where votes are being cast and so on. The IEC could still do the counting, but there'd be more transparency, because I predict that, well, I anticipate that in 2019 there'd be a lot of court challenges because of the tightness and the closeness of the election. So if you can have a process where each ballot paper is identifiable and people can see this is where it was counted and so on, and then people can access that online, I think it will make the process more expedient and it will speed that up. So I think that's something that perhaps could get looked at. But in terms of the vote rigging, particularly with this Metsimaholo where people are getting bussed in, I think within the counting mechanism where for a ward you have sort of like a first past the mark type person, so a 50% plus one type thing, and then any other votes beyond that don't really make an impact in terms of the ward. So all of those other votes, like let's say you had 80% of the ward, those votes then would get counted in terms of a proportional representation. So it almost all balances out, I think, ultimately at the end of the day. So it wouldn't have that much of a material impact. But I think with the national election, there needs to be a more transparent process.
And Mr. Tsilane, just finally, with regard to the announcement of the results, it took quite a while. And this is just one municipality. It's not even a big municipality for that matter. So what sort of concerns, do you have around the sort of issues that played out and that eventually delayed the announcement of the outcome there?
I want to respond to one of the questions that you've actually asked in relation to the issue of people being bussed to the stations. As we may recall, the issue of busing, we've been dealing with it following Tlokwe and Josini and Kwamashu, because there were those kind of incidents. But this issue becomes much more relevant during registration and not during the elections. Because during the elections, only people whose names appear at the voting station are the only people who are going to be voting. And then you can't vote outside your ward. So if
are you saying it didn't happen?
No, it didn't happen. It can't happen. Because if your name is not there, how are you going to be, even if you can go and bus people from Soweto in 20 buses, How are they going to vote when their names are not there? So it is much more relevant during the registration process, where you find people coming from one area to the other in order to try to influence the outcome of the elections. So we've had those kind of challenges where people are saying people are being bussed here. But in reality, busing in terms of the way we understand it, it's when a political party is bringing people to a particular area in order to inflate the numbers and try to influence the outcome of the elections. That particular aspect did not occur because people who were voting were already on the voters' roll. You know, so that's my response to that particular aspect.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Terry Tselane. And of course, we'll continue the show. And after the break, we'll take a look at ANC internal squabbles as we gear up for the 54th election conference. But more on this when we return.
Show me a greater power on the whole continent of Africa. Show me a greater power anyway.
6th of June 1918 was the establishment of our movement to maintain that.
We need to do something about the educational upliftment of the Afrikaner, and we also need to do something about the economic upliftment of the Afrikaner. And that was the two main goals at that stage in 1918.
The Broederbond never was a cultural organization. It was a state-capturing organization. It is, in fact...
I like that term.
It has captured the financial systems. It has captured the parastatals. It has captured cultural organizations.
For all your constitutional and legal matters, tune into Rights and Recourse on Sundays between 2 and 3 Central African Time.
We cross live, give updates and cover sport.
The observer missions, what are they saying?
It will be a very difficult announcement to make, to say whether these elections have been free and fair.
1 in every 100 people are diagnosed with arthritis daily. In an effort to raise awareness, a handful of elderly women, they took to the streets of Soweto to stretch their fight against the ailment.
Western Province upset the Sharks by 33 points to 21 to be crowned the 2017 Currie Cup champions at the Kings Park Stadium.
In Durban.
On time with weather every hour, all the time. For all news, stay tuned to AM News every Saturday and Sunday at 10:00 hours Central African Time.
Welcome back. And with only 2 weeks left before one of the most anticipated ANC elective conferences ever, the party continues to experience challenges, with many now asking whether the conference will actually go ahead. Now, the 54th elective conference is scheduled to start on December the 16th. And this week, the High Court in Bloemfontein barred the party's Free State structure from holding its provincial conference this weekend, and thereby declaring branch general meetings held in 4 regions unlawful, bringing questions about the upcoming Provincial General Council, which was set for this weekend. The fate of the ANC's KZN leadership also still hanging in the balance, as the Pietermaritzburg High Court set aside the ANC KwaZulu-Natal application for leave to appeal against the September judgment by the High Court, which declared the 2015 elective conference illegal. Let's just take a look at this insert before we get into the discussion.
Tensions have been simmering between ANC supporters in the Free State. At the heart of it, it's supporters of presidential hopefuls, former AU Commission Chair Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa. Police have been deployed to the party's provincial headquarters in Bloemfontein. The High Court found irregularities at 29 Free State ANC's branch general meetings. The meetings are crucial to nominate delegates who will participate at conferences due to take place as from the 16th of December. Concerned members say the party will not be ready to proceed with the provincial elective conference next week. They also want the Tuesday's Provincial General Council nullified.
We also want to get a clarity if the NEC still allows that, the PEC of the ANC must proceed with the provincial conference, whilst there were no even logistical arrangement around the branches nomination forms for the provincial executive committee.
Disgruntled Free State ANC members want the PEC dissolved and the provincial task team be appointed. The ANC says it's confident that the High Court order will have no bearing on the Provincial General Council and that it will be able to convene biennial meetings at 29 branches which have been cited in the court order. Free State ANC longest-serving chairperson Ace Makashule and his long-time ally Thabo Manyoni are likely to face off. It was the fourth time in 2 months that the Free State ANC has been taken to court. The 3 previous attempts were unsuccessful. Teboho Letshaba, SABC News, Bloemfontein.
Well, I guess the delegates are now in all earnest literally packing their bags to go to conference. It's 2 weeks to go. But let's start here. This is Media Monitor after all. Can we start by just taking a look at the role of the media and how the media have covered this and where the focus has been and whether it has been the correct focus? Milo, let's start with you.
I think for me, obviously, the media, I would say they have taken sides in terms of which candidate they want to see win. And from my reading of sort of like the major newspaper publications, you get a sense that Cyril Ramaphosa is being punted as the candidate that would sort of like be friendly to that extent. And this you see obviously in the way some of the headlines are presented. So for example, you'd say that Cyril Ramaphosa wins province, and then with NDZ is that, the NDZ faction, but then so they'd have be some pejorative word, the NDZ faction like is leading or something like that. But with Cyril, they present in a positive light that Cyril is leading the candidate list and so on. So I think those type of things, you do pick them up, nuances in terms of who the media is sort of favoring in that sense. But in terms of coverage, I think the media organizations have really excelled in terms of, if you look at across all the news stations, they have dedicated sort of like inserts for the ANC presidential election. So I do think that is happening. But in terms of the court battles, for me, the interesting thing that is going to play out here is that I think each of the provincial battles have different impacts on the ANC going forward. For example, the KZN battle, I think for me, that has an impact on the powers of the ANC NEC. The Eastern Cape one has an impact on terms of the violence at ANC conferences. And this Free State one, I think for me, that one seems to be more of a political squabble. So just to explain the KZN one, if you look at if you read the judgment, the substantive issue that's being talked about there is the issue of the timing of the conference. But then if you look at the ANC constitution gives sort of like the NEC sort of like a prerogative to be able to sanction conferences and say, no, the conference can go ahead or not. And the ANC PEC...
So there's been a lot of talk about the courts having to teach the ANC, their own constitution, or perhaps interpret it for the ANC. Is that fair?
Well, it's a very important point you are making, especially because with regard to the Free State, I mean, you remember that in 2012, leading to the Mangaung elective conference of the ANC, there were branches who complained. And the matter went up to the Constitutional Court. For the first time, the Constitutional Court had to take a decision whether or not courts, in fact, could intervene in internal squabbles of the ANC. And that judgment set out elaborately on why courts can actually intervene to protect the rights of members of political parties to exercise their political rights within those organizations. And it actually even referred to the Bill of Rights, that the whole struggle for liberation in South Africa was for people to choose whether they want to participate in political parties, to establish political parties. So from that point of view, it said, yes, courts can actually intervene. In fact, it went to the extent of setting aside some of the decisions taken by the Free State ANC, and those branches were given time to participate in the elective conference in 2012. Now, the Free State being the one which was actually taught by the Constitutional Court on how to run internal affairs, actually shocking that years later, it's not learning. 29 branches are said to have held branch general meetings irregularly. And so many branches are underrepresented in this PGC that took place. Some of them that were there probably were not entitled to be there. And that now is now setting up yet another the possibility that actually coming to the national elective conference, there's a real possibility that some other people might challenge the outcome on the basis that the processes followed were not proper.
Before we get to the actual conference, the other thing, just still on the media coverage, and you talk about perhaps bias reporting. With all the talk around state capture, I found it very interesting that there was absolutely no focus on who are the people who are around the lead candidates. I mean, who are the people propping up their bids in great detail? Because capture doesn't just happen at the time when someone becomes president. It happens way before. You choose your candidate and you back that candidate for better or hopefully, not for worse, because this is the person you're backing for a reason. So why haven't we seen more of that in the media?
I think it's a very good point that you raise, and I think part of the problem there is that the campaigning happens within the branches, right? And the branches, it's almost like closed off to the media, so people don't necessarily have full view into some sort of look-through capacity into what's happening at that level. But then what you're saying is very important to the sense that no person can run a campaign on their own. There's always backers and there's always sort of like groupings of people within the ANC who are supporting a particular candidate.
But not just within the ANC, outside of the ANC, particularly private and corporate interests. Who are the people who are backing Cyril Ramaphosa? Who's backing Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Lindiwe Sisulu, and all of that? I would have loved to see that amidst all the talk about state capture.
It has come out, but perhaps not sufficient enough, not in more detail as we would like to see, because if you really want to know what people stand for, you need to know who's backing them. Who is the attitude, or what's the attitude, or the policies, or the views of the people that are backing them, and what's the source of the money?
We've heard Mazotti, but
we've heard Mazotti, the cigarettes people, and there's always insinuations that Cyril Ramaphosa is being supported by white monopoly capital, but you never actually get to see this alleged backers of Ramaphosa who are allegedly white. So there's always that kind of insinuations, and I think that it's a question of policy and regulation. We need to find a way in this country to regulate campaigns, not inter-party campaigns, but intra-party campaigns where people are forced to be open about who is backing them. Because otherwise we can maybe backing Sakina, but we may be backing the wrong horse because someone else is behind her.
And coming to the conference proper, and there is of course concern given all the challenges, all the squabbles and the factionalism currently playing out, that a conference may not actually sit. And if it does, there might be difficulty getting past the credentials stage. If you get past that, there's still the very real possibility of conference collapsing, given what we've seen in some of the provinces.
Well, the Secretary General, Gwede Mantashe, who's actually the man behind this conference, who's organizing everything about this conference, has assured everyone that this conference will take place. It's in the interest of everyone for it to take place. But it's one thing for him to wish that it takes place. It's another to look at the realities. The realities is that there are court challenges. Some people might say, well, this conference must not take place until these legal issues are resolved. So we know who has got a right to participate, who has got no right to participate. That's one thing. At another level, you can ignore these legal challenges, have the conference going ahead, and then people would use these current legal challenges as the basis for them to dispute the outcome of the conference afterwards. So the conference might take place, but its outcome might be disputed. So it's in the interest of the ANC to resolve these legal issues prior to the conference.
Mela?
I think for me, an interesting thing that we need to look at in terms of the ANC is that the conference itself is constituted by 90% branch members, right? And in that process, the Secretary General's office has sort of done some sort of audit for which branches qualify and so on. And I don't think there has been much dispute about the 4,723 branches that have been audited and that have been submitting names for the conference, right? So the challenges that are coming through now, it's challenges for PEC structures and for provincial executive structures. That's a separate thing, because if you look at that 90%, the 10% is provincial representatives, and it's a league representative, veterans, youth league, and so on. So what is being contested now, it's that 10%, and I think from a materiality perspective, it might not be that significant unless the conference is really tight in terms of numbers. And even over and above that, in terms of voting for the conference, right, what you have is that the powers of a provincial structure, basically, within that conference structure, is maybe to nominate somebody. It's not to vote. People still vote through branches. So branches are the main vehicle through which that conference is going to happen.
But Sakina,
just to speak to the point of that the conference might actually be disputed afterwards. So I think the disputes will come either from the electoral process that's going to get get adopted at conference, but I don't necessarily see it coming from having invalid provincial structures that the conference might get disputed.
Where the PECs actually matter, where I differ slightly with you, is that for as long as they have the authority as provincial executive council of that province, then they can disband branches, they can discipline members of the branches, which is what has been happening in KwaZulu-Natal. That's why they become important.
But through the Secretary General's office.
And of course it doesn't end there, because when the delegates actually go to conference, they are still open to lobbying before the actual voting takes place at conference. So still much to happen there. And we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll continue with Media Monitor and some other conversations around what's happening on the continent as well.
In the belly of the beast, the vulnerable are easy targets in the streets. Marauding gangs terrorize communities mercilessly. With no respect for human life. Animals are also not spared. The money business knows no boundaries. There is no respect for life. Helpless communities silenced by their pain. Can their last defense be in time to the rescue? Special assignment Saturday at 5:30 p.m. when we unravel the truth.
We're now firmly on the back nine here on Media Monitor, and in this final segment we'll be discussing what is happening on the continent. The world still reeling from shocking images that were shown of African migrants by CNN. Now, it showed migrants being sold as goods, commodity in Libya, and the country is mainly used as a transit point by desperate African refugees trying to reach Europe in search of a better life, and in the process hundreds have perished at sea and their bodies forever entombed in the Mediterranean. And now we want to ask our panel, has the media in particular done enough to expose these atrocities, especially in countries with civil strife? And if they did, how can such despicable acts still be allowed to take place in the 21st century? And as I say that, you know, you have this refrain, never and never again will these sort of atrocities happen. But unfortunately, they are happening in our lifetime. And people being sold, human beings being sold. And the CNN clip that got the world to actually pay attention, even though others had reported about this, but it took CNN's clip for the UN and most world leaders to actually sit back and take note of what was happening. And that was a clip where they showed about 12 migrants or slaves being sold, and took roughly 6 seconds for each one to be valued, your worth as a human being, and sold off. And that is the despicable atrocity that we sit with today. But where did all of this start? Who should take the blame? And I know people say we shouldn't look to point fingers, but someone has to pay for this.
I think for me, what's important in this thing is context. And then the fact that CNN is sort of taking a lead in this, I think provides us one of the great media ironies around this whole slave issue, right? Because if you look at the genesis of this thing, it comes from the fall of Gaddafi. When Gaddafi was deposed, it was the Western media who was drumming the war drums that no, the Western countries must go and attack Libya and go and establish a no-fly zone there. So I think without those media houses sort of like drumming that drum, it would be very difficult, I think, for us to be in this type of situation. Yes, it has been reported that Arab or maybe black relations in the North Africa are not the best of things. Slavery does happen there, but not to this extent. So I think without that notion of what happened at the UN Council, where the NATO forced sort of like some vote to go and depose Gaddafi, we wouldn't be here. That's the first thing. I think the second thing, what's happening now in Libya is that you're having sort of like civil strife, where various organizations are contesting for power, and you do not have really some sort of legitimate government that everybody respects within that country. So within such a context, it's very difficult now to come as a united United Nations to come as a South Africa and AU or somebody and say, you know what, put an end to this. Because who are you going to speak to? There's a warlord that's running that area, there's a warlord that's running that other area. So I think from that perspective, yes, CNN has done a good job in exposing this, but then also they must take accountability for the role that they played in the overthrow of Gaddafi.
But more than that, I mean, this slave trade in Libya didn't start in 2017. It started many years ago, quite shortly after Gaddafi's fall. But also other news agencies, other NGOs working in the area, they've spoken about this. They have tried to highlight this, but nobody was listening until CNN said, hey, this is really happening, Mpumelelo.
Of course. I mean, look, before we even get to see these grotesque images of slave trade, I mean, there's always been stories about human trafficking internally in the continent as well across the continent. People being trafficked all over the world for various reasons. But I think that the media has been reporting on those cases. I think what is lacking now is to actually get the context right. Why is it that people are now so brazen as to even sell people openly in what is reminiscent of an era that we thought was long buried?
Let's look at that. We've been reporting about the migrant crisis, people dying on the Mediterranean. But then the EU, this became a serious crisis for them. It became, a rallying point for political parties around elections in Europe. And one of the things they did, they started paying countries like Libya to keep the migrants out of those international waters and to stop them from ever even reaching, European shores. So what sort of accountability must they take for that?
No, for me, it's a question of the Western countries not taking responsibility for the collapse of Libya. Because what happened is that however awful or disgusting or authoritarian or dictatorial Gaddafi's government was, the point is that there was a state in Libya that was functioning. It had authority. There was some kind of order. There was no democracy. There were no human rights. But there was some kind of a state that was governing the territory. So as soon as you depose Gaddafi, you actually deprive that whole area of some kind of state authority. So the West deposed Gaddafi without a post-Gaddafi plan on how this country should be run. So as a result, you're having this lawlessness that is happening there, and Libya is basically a failed state.
What about the African media? Because there are people who have escaped from these camps and they have spoken about this, they've reported it. And why haven't we done more?
I absolutely agree with you. And if I'm following what you're saying correctly, it's the notion of our media consumption always some way needs to be mediated through Europe and America. What is happening in Zimbabwe first needs to go to the UK, then we can have interest in it. What's happening in Libya first needs to go to America, then we can have interest in it. It can never be that media organizations within the continent report something and we take it seriously. It's precisely to what is happening right now. It took CNN to expose this thing for people to actually sit up and listen and say, actually, no, what is happening here? So that's precisely part of the narrative. And I do not know whether that narrative that happens is because African media houses lack resources or African media houses perhaps do not have the interest or do not think that what's happening on the rest of the continent is that much influential. So
which is certainly something that we need to interrogate. But you touched on Zimbabwe. Let's talk about Emmerson Mnangagwa's cabinet very quickly. I think after all the excitement and the euphoria, that brought some people back to earth with a thud there.
Well, for me, I mean, this whole cabinet of Namanga is interesting, but this is a recycling of the old guard, basically. And the one tragic thing that is happening in Zimbabwe, actually, is the fact that even with the Mnangagwa era that has just started now, you still see the role of the military. I mean, one of the spokespersons of the military, I mean, Spuso Moyo, is now the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So you're actually entrenching the role of the military in politics, which will be very difficult for the opposition to deal with if they were to win elections, because they too will have to have in cabinet people from the military. So the military has now been given disproportionate power in the Zimbabwean context.
Surprised?
For me, it's not surprising. I mean, if we looked at the coup, that was not a coup, right? Because ultimately what happened there is that you had a political squabble. And in that political squabble, the military came in as a referee. So what happened is that Grace Mugabe and Jonathan Moyo and that faction basically outmaneuvered Mnangagwa within cabinet. And then when they outmaneuvered him politically, he couldn't accept that they outmaneuvered him politically and go to ZANU-PF and mobilize politically. Instead, what he did is that he went and he called the military and said, military, I'm being defeated here politically, so come in and with force and then ensure that our faction wins. So that is precisely what has happened now, is that the military now has installed the faction of ZANU-PF into the leadership of Zimbabwe. And then the way that that's going to play out now is that when you have the elections now, obviously the military would want some sort of continuation now, because as you can see with this Moyo guy and a couple of other generals that are now sitting within that cabinet they are there now to ensure that they are gatekeepers for the continuation of the structure that's been happening there.
And of course, no one from the opposition parties cracking a nod in Mnangagwa's cabinet. And gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this morning. But before we say our goodbyes, let's just take a look at what made news on this day 50 years ago exactly.
The world's first heart transplant has been performed. Medical history has been made in South Africa. Newspapers everywhere carry banner headlines, and from medical men as far away as the Soviet Union, there is acclaim for the dramatic breakthrough. Groote Schuur Hospital in the Cape is now the focal point of world attention, and these are the men responsible. Dr. Marius Barnard, Dr. M.C. Buerta, Professor Jannie Louw, Professor Chris Barnard, and Mr. John van Heerden. There are thousands of telegrams of congratulation and a battery of television and motion picture cameramen anxious for interviews. In 5 drama-filled hours, the heart of Mr. Nissan Darvel, who was tragically killed in an accident, was transferred to the body of Mr. Louis Washkansky, a 53-year-old businessman suffering from an incurable heart disease. Professor Barnard and his team have and will continue to receive the acclaim of the world. Only time can tell if the operation will be successful, but their achievement represents a great milestone in medical research.
Well, Melo and Mpumelelo, unfortunately, we don't have time for you for your input. But of course, just a reminder, that Groote Schuur Hospital is a public hospital. The first world transplant happened in a public hospital in South Africa. And I think that's the standard to which we should be aspiring. But thank you so much for watching our show, Media Monitor. And we hope that we will see you again, same time next week. And from me and the team, it's goodbye and do stay blessed.